Famed novelist Paul Sheldon is the author of a successful series of Victorian romance novels featuring a character named Misery Chastain. He always stays at Silver Creek in Colorado when he has to finish his book. He is writing a manuscript for a new novel that he hopes will launch his post-Misery career. He then stacks all the papers and inserts them inside a brown leather folder, picks up his champagne bottle, pours some into the glass, and lights a cigarette. Whenever Paul finishes his novel, he needs these 3 things to celebrate his accomplishment. He then takes his novel to his agent Marcia to discuss it. Paul places the folder at the back of his car seat, driving through the snow and heading towards his home in New York City. While Paul is driving, the weather gets harsh, and he gets caught in a blizzard and is met by an accident, rendering him unconscious. Paul is seen unconscious, still stuck in the car. An unknown person drags him out of the car and helps him to breathe by giving CPR. She then secures his folder in her jacket and lifts him on his shoulders, heading towards her home. The unknown person is his obsessive fan, Annie. Annie reveals to Paul that she is his biggest fan and introduces herself to him as a nurse and tells him that he is there in her house since 2 days now and gives him 2 red pills to swallow. Annie is taking care of him. He then asks her why didn't she take him to the hospital, and she lies that the blizzard was too strong and she couldn't risk his life and that she tried calling but the telephone lines were down. Annie tells him about his injuries, that he has an injured arm which is going to get better, but his shoulder got dislocated which she managed to locate and she did a great job on his legs. He had multiple fractures and says that she would take him to the hospital once the roads are clear, but meanwhile, it's an honor for her to take care of him in her house. Marcia is worried and calls the sheriff. She reports about missing Paul and tells her that his daughter is worried. He usually goes to Silver Creek to finish his novel, but she called and came to know that he checked out last Tuesday. The sheriff told her that nobody else reported, but he will look into the matter. He asks his wife when was the last blizzard and she replies last Tuesday and then walks away. The sheriff doubts that Paul is also missing since the day of the blizzard, so it might have a link with his gone missing. Annie is shaving Paul's beard and telling him that she found him on her way back home and that she had always been curious to know about what he writes in his Silver Creek cabin. Paul then wishes to call his daughter as she must be worried. She said the phone lines will start working once the roads are clear, and to give her the numbers, she will keep on trying. She then asks for the favor that she wants to read his new book, to which Paul replies that no one is allowed to read before it's published, but she has saved his life and she may. This was the permission he granted for his own misery. The sheriff has started his investigation. He visited Silver Creek where Paul last visited, where the manager tells him that he has always been a good guest. He always orders a bottle of champagne only when he stays, and tells him about his car that he always comes in. He tells his car number and model. Annie is seen feeding soup to Paul and she says that she has read a few pages and tells Paul that the book has no nobility in it due to the usage of curse words. Paul replies that that's how slum kids talk. He was also a slum kid. Hearing this, Annie gets angry, saying that she would never do this, walking up on the store and asking for things in an inappropriate manner and using curse words. She then drops the soup and then the spoon out of rage, suddenly realizing that she overreacted and apologizes to Paul. Paul forgives her, but he was also surprised by her reaction. She confesses that she loves him, his mind, and then she leaves. Paul is still looking at her as if she is insane. The sheriff and his wife driving through the snow. His wife is also his deputy, and he asks her to pull over. He then gets off the car and examines a broken branch, assuming it can be something related to Paul's missing. He then slides down the snow looking for some sign of his car, but he is unable to find anything. He then turns back and then the camera shows a tire, with rest of Paul's car covered in snow. He climbs up to his wife and tells her that if Paul is out there, then he is surely dead. As soon as they sit in the car, Annie is passing by them in her car. Both don't seem to notice each other. Paul is in bed, and Annie enters excitedly Paul's room, with a book in her hand named Misery's Childhood, which was one of the books in his novel series, and tells him she bought the first copy of it. She then tells him that she called the hospital and spoke to the doctor. He said there is no need to hospitalize Paul as long as there is no infection, and they will send an ambulance as soon as the hospital opens. Paul then asks if the telephone lines are still working. She said yes, but hers is still out of order. He then tells her that it's his daughter's birthday today and he needs to call her, but she says he will have to wait. She is constantly trying to distract him by changing the conversation. She leaves praising his book. Annie brings him a special breakfast and tells him that she is on page 75 of the book, and the book is just perfect. She then leaves as she is curious to read the whole book. The door opens and a brown pig enters. Annie introduces her pet Misery to Paul. She kept her pet's name Misery as she is Paul's #1 fan and obsessed with this character. She tells him that she is on page 300 of the book now and it's divine, and then she leaves with her pig. The scene shows Annie standing near the window, talking to Paul, telling him that she got very upset after her husband left her. She was getting crazy, so she started some extra night shifts. She then started reading, and that is how she discovered Misery. Misery gave her happiness. She would read the books again and again. She is so lost in her conversation that she tells him that he must be a special person who can make her walk down the aisle again, and then she leaves saying that she is going to finish reading her book. It's nighttime. Annie enters Paul's room in a rage and shouts at him that Misery cannot die. How can he do this? She gets crazy banging on his bed, and then picks up a chair and throws it on the wall. She says that he is a bad person and she thought that he was a good one. She then further says that she needs to stay away from him for a while, and tells him the truth that he should not expect anyone to come here looking for him, as she never called any agent or hospital, and that he should pray that nothing happens to her because if she is dead then so is he. She leaves the house in a car. Paul is worried and now started to believe that she is insane and dangerous to him. He tries to escape, falls to the floor, and crawls towards the door, but the door is locked. Now escaping from Annie is his only mission. Meanwhile, the sheriff's still looking for Paul, talking on the phone and informing Marcia that the FBI has been informed regarding the missing Paul and they are into it. The sheriff's wife informs him that Silver Creek did not receive any call from him too. Annie is back the next morning and finds him on the floor. She helps him to get into bed and tucks him in. She tells him that she has got a little surprise for him, as she has prayed that God shows him a way. She brings in a grill which had his book placed on it and asks him to lit it on fire and do good to the world. He says that he can't burn his own book and the publishers already have it. She says, I know he doesn't make copies of his book and this is his first copy. Annie knows everything about Paul. She starts to drop fuel on him, which means if he didn't do it she would set him on fire. So he had no other choice other than to burn his book, so he did so. Annie then waters the fire. And then they suddenly hear the sound of a helicopter. Sheriff is having an aerial view of the area and assumes that there is only one house located there. Paul seemed quite hopeful that someone has come to his rescue. But the helicopter passes. Annie looks at the helicopter and says it has something to do with the ozone layer. Annie then gives 2 pills to Paul and leaves. Paul looks at them and hides the pills under his bed. He has a plan in his mind. Annie is watching a show on TV and enjoying her snacks in bed. Paul is having his meal and hiding the pills again. She served him dinner. Annie brings Paul some stuff: a wheelchair and an electric shaver. She then surprises him with a small studio, a table, typewriter, paper, and ink, and instructs him to write a new book, Misery Return, and make the world happy. He can write the book in the honor of saving his life and nursing him. She wanted her favorite character Misery to return and stay alive. She then leaves and Paul finds a hairpin lying on the floor. He has another plan in mind that would send Annie out of the house and give him time to escape. He requests her for a new paper as the one she brought smudges ink. She said, I bought one of the most expensive papers. He then shows her and she gets angry for not appreciating her and keeps on demanding. And she hits him on his leg with the paper rim, leaving Paul in pain. After she leaves, Paul grabs the pin and struggles to unlock the door of his room, to which he succeeds as Annie always locks him up inside when she is not in the room. He then rolls himself and finds the telephone. He tries to make a call and then finds out that the telephone was a dummy and there are no wires connected. Annie is in a store buying the papers and then she heads back home. Meanwhile, Paul is still struggling to find a way. He is moving around in the house and accidentally hits a table and a penguin falls, which he manages to catch and puts it back. He then finds a shelf of books written by him and his own portrait. Looking around, he finds another room, where he finds a lot of medicines and grabs those red pills. He then struggles to enter the kitchen but his wheelchair gets stuck. So he crawls up to the door but the door is locked. Annie is heading back home. He hears his car and quickly crawls back into his wheelchair, closing the door and then locking his room again with the pin. Annie enters his room and finds him sweaty. She asks him that what he has been doing and he says that he is in extreme pain and he needs his pills now, as he wanted to hide the pills from her. She quickly brings him pills and tucks him in bed, apologizing again for her behavior and accepts that she has some anger issues. She then hands over a writing pad to him in case he has any idea in his mind. The next scene shows Sheriff spotting Paul's car from a helicopter. Paul's car is lifted and reporters are seen, a cop updating news regarding Paul's car that they have just found. The cops telling that Paul somehow managed to crawl out of the car but he is still not found. The sheriff finds out that Paul's car door has a dent on it, which means he was pulled out by someone. Meanwhile, Paul is seen folding a paper and then emptying the capsule powder in it. He wanted to sedate Annie so that he could escape. Paul is typing and Annie enters. She tells him that he needs to type all over again, and then she gets hyper as always, telling about her childhood story and then telling him to start from where Misery was buried in the grave. She was still mad at Misery's death. Paul has no way out but to write a new book with an ending that won't make Annie upset again, as whenever she gets upset she attacks Paul. Annie is reading his story again, that he has now written, and this time she is happy with what he has written and curious to know what will happen next. She is happy that Misery is finally back and she is going to spend a life full of romance. On seeing her happy, Paul offers her to have dinner with him tonight to celebrate Misery's return and she is honored by his invitation. She leaves to prepare dinner. Paul hopes to accomplish her plan of sedating her with the powder she has been collecting from the pills. Meanwhile, the sheriff, still working on his mission, tells his wife that he has bought Paul's book and that if he can't find him, he can at least find out what he writes about. His wife mocks him, saying how would reading his book help him find Paul. Sheriff smiles that her sarcasm makes their marriage spicier. Paul and Annie are having a special dinner. Paul praises her food. He then wishes to have a toast for Misery, who has returned, and pours some champagne into the glass. He then asks Annie to bring a candle so they can enjoy it. She leaves to look for it, and when she leaves, Paul adds the powder to her glass. She lights the candle, and as she is about to drink it, the glass drops on the table accidentally and the drugged champagne is spilled, ruining Paul's plan to sedate her. She then pours more champagne and they have toast. Paul is seen typing, Annie caressing her pet, and the sheriff reading Paul's book. It is running outside. Annie enters the room, Worn out, and hands Paul his pills. Paul asks about her and she says that Rain sometimes gives her blues. She further adds that at first she used to love Paul as a writer, but now she has started to love him in real too. And she knows that Paul doesn't love her and is going to leave her soon as he is getting better. Paul, who now knows how to deal with her, lies and says that he will never leave as he likes it there. Annie takes out a gun from her pocket and tells him that she is going to use it sometime. This scared Paul. She then leaves and drives away from the house. Paul gets a chance to escape from the room while Annie is away. He gets the knife from the kitchen as after knowing she has a gun, he needs to have something for his defense. The sheriff is seen reading Paul's book and writing down some lines from his book. Meanwhile, Paul looks into Annie's memory lane and finds out that Annie was behind bars for being responsible for infants who died at the hospital where she was serving as a nurse. Paul gets back to his bed and is seen practicing how to attack Annie with the knife, as now he knows that Annie is insane and a killer too. Paul is waiting for Annie. She comes in later while he is sleeping, and she sedates him with an injection. The next morning he is in bed and finds himself tied. Annie tells him that she knows he has been out twice as she places her ceramic penguin towards south always, and it wasn't. Paul could sense danger and he tries to look for the knife that he hid under his bed, which was in Annie's hand now. She also had that hairpin in her hand, which he used to unlock the door. She then puts a wooden block between his feet and hammers both of his ankles so that he can't run away. Paul cries in pain. Annie leaves the house in a rage and gets into a little car fight with another driver. Outside Sheriff's office, Sheriff hears someone shouting and comes out of his cabin. Notices Annie, he rushes back and grabs a paper on which he had copied his lines from Paul's book, and leaves. He is now looking at the old newspaper, where he finds Annie's news, and then he matches the words that were said by Annie when she got arrested with the words he had copied from Paul's book. Sheriff makes his last attempt to clear his doubt about Annie. He goes to a shop and the shopkeeper tells him about the typewriter that was bought recently by Annie. The sheriff heads toward Annie's home, and Annie quickly sedates Paul as she sees someone heading home, which she knew must be a cop as she does not have any visitors at home. Paul tries to strangle her, but then he is sedated. Annie hides him in the basement, clearing out all his evidence. She opens the door before the sheriff knocks, and the sheriff asks if she knows about Paul. She tells him that she is his biggest fan. Sheriff adds that Paul is missing and she replies how upset she is. She invites her in. She tells him how God told him that as she is Paul's #1 fan and now he is missing, she should start writing too. So she bought a typewriter and the same paper that Paul used to use for his typing. She leaves to make a cup of cocoa for him. The sheriff looks around, goes upstairs and checks the room, and then leaves without having to drink. While he is going, he hears some noise and rushes back in, calling Annie if she is all right. Paul calls for help. The sheriff opens the door and at the same time Sheriff gets shot by Annie and dies. Annie tells Paul that it had to happen, and she was meant to protect him and they are both meant to be together. She then tells him that she has 2 bullets in the gun and she will shoot him and then herself. She brings him injection and a gun and tells her that she loves him and he should not panic, and the death will be easy. She plans to shoot him after sedating him. Paul lies that he loves her too and they should not die before finishing the book. Annie has a fear that the cops will be here soon, but he assures her that he will be finished with the book before dawn. Annie leaves to get his wheelchair and Paul manages to hide the charcoal bottle in his trousers. He has another plan in mind. Paul is typing. Annie is curious to know the ending, but he keeps the suspense and asks for the 3 things he always uses after he finishes his book. Annie knew that he needed a cigarette, a matchstick, and his special champagne. She then sets all these in a tray and keeps the gun in her pocket. She serves him and he asks her to bring another glass for herself too. Meanwhile, he quickly throws fuel on the papers to burn them. As soon as she enters, he tells her that these papers have all the answers to her queries, as she was curious to know about the story. Paul burns them. She screams and bends down. Paul picks up the typewriter and hits it on her head. They both struggle to fight each other back. Annie shoots him on his shoulder, but he attacks her again, hitting her on her face. Annie falls on the typewriter, hits her head, and is unconscious. Paul thinks that she is dead, crawls out of the door, and soon gets attacked again by Annie from behind. He hits the metal piece on her head and Annie is dead. The next scene shows Paul walking with a stick, entering a restaurant, where Marcia is waiting for her. She shows him the first copy of his new book. This time he wrote a book about his experiences with Annie. And at the same time he sees the waitress, Annie, who is moving toward him. He keeps staring at her and when she comes close, he realizes that she is just in his mind. The waitress tells him that she is his biggest fan. The camera fades away with Paul smiling at her.